The one-strike rule. In modern gaming, this is not just a trend, it's a natural law. You get one chance to make a first impression, and if you fail, you're done. When Wuthering Waves launched, it didn't just look bad, it looked cursed. Stuttering performance, messy translation, a story delivered so poorly that players were already begging for a skip button. So when the internet called it dead on arrival, it didn't feel like an overreaction, it felt obvious. But if it was really that broken, how did it turn into a game that had streamers in tears over its story? Was it just luck, or did people completely misjudge the studio behind it? You see, in live service games, they usually follow one brutal rule. You get only one launch and one launch only. If that first impression is bad enough, the players don't wait around for you to have a redemption arc, they brand you DOA and just leave. And that's why the initial verdict on Wuthering Waves felt so final. This wasn't just negative feedback, it was a death sentence. The game looked unstable, unfinished, and way too messy to survive in a genre that punishes weak openings hard. So when people called it dead on arrival, it wasn't just blind hate, it was the kind of conclusion that was written all over it. And honestly guys, based on the first week alone, it was hard to argue with. But that's where the story gets weird, because if the launch verdict was so obviously correct, why didn't it stay that way? Wuthering Waves didn't bleed out, it stabilized, then it grew, and it even became marked as evergreen by Tencent. To understand how this happened, we need to look past the launch itself and ask a much better question. What kind of studio was actually behind the failed launch? Now, most people looked at the launch and saw a rookie studio drowning in its own ambition. And from the outside, it looked true. But what it missed was something important. Kuro was not amateur guessing their way through action combat. Years before this, Wuthering Waves made Punishing Grey Raven. It never became some giant mainstream takeover, but the people who played it could tell you one thing that Kuro was good at: combat. The tight dodges, sharp timing, real pressure in the fights. The kind of game that makes you realize the studio actually understands how action is supposed to feel. It felt like you were playing your favorite anime protagonist. And that's exactly what made Wuthering Waves launch feel so strange. It wasn't some clueless team guessing their way through game development. This was a studio that had proof. It could build the mechanics people respected. They knew how to make characters that people got attached to. And in forums you can hear it a lot. People calling it the most generous gacha. But then the launch day came, and all of that experience got buried under instability, technical issues, and a first impression so bad it made the whole project look doomed. And the deeper you looked, the worse it got. So here's the thing guys. Flawless combat is awesome. Crazy detailed animations, we love it. It's things that players in these games want. But that doesn't mean much if you can't get the game to run. Because when Wuthering Waves launched, it wasn't just a little rough around the edges, it was a real technical mess. Players were dealing with stuttering, crashes, blurry visuals, and performance issues bad enough to make the whole game feel unplayable. And if you were on mobile, it looked even worse. But the tech promos were only half of it. Even the players who did get through the performance issues ran into a story that felt overloaded, awkwardly delivered, and way harder to care about than it should have been. A lot of people weren't trying to understand the narrative anymore, they were just looking for a skip button. And then came the localization problems. Not just typos, real trust-damaging mistakes. In Japan, one of the 5-star weapons promised mechanics that didn't even exist. And once you ask people to spend this amount of real money based on that kind of text, this stops feeling like a launch issue, it starts feeling like a serious failure. So when people started calling the game dead on arrival, there wasn't some irrational internet overreaction. At that point, it felt completely earned. And if that had been the full story, internet's harsh obituary would have been completely correct. But it wasn't. Because once you pushed past all the mess in the launch, the game underneath didn't feel hollow. That's the part a lot of people missed. A hollow game usually gives it away really fast. It's something that we can just feel. The uninteresting story, the stale movements, the awkward combat. But Wuthering Waves, it didn't feel like that. When the game actually worked, the combat had weight. Parries felt satisfying, dodges felt good, and the counters, they had real punch. Abilities weren't just flashy, they had flow. It felt like a game built by people who cared about how action feels, not just how it looks in a trailer. And it wasn't just the fighting. The movement mattered too. Wall running, grappling, running through obstacles. The way freerunning made exploration satisfying. It felt like the game wanted you to enjoy moving through the world, not just teleport past to the next objective. Then there were the smaller details too, the animation touches, the game and cultural references. Small details most players won't ever see or know about, but they can still feel it in the game. This kind of care you don't usually get from something that's empty inside. And this is why the launch was so unusual. The surface looked broken, but the core didn't feel like that. It felt like a genuinely strong action RPG trapped inside a terrible first impression. And for a lot of players, this was the difference. Not enough to forgive the launch, but enough to not walk away immediately. The problem was, a real core wasn't enough on its own. Kuro now had to prove that they were actually listening and wanted to give something good to the players that stayed. And this is where Kuro did the one thing that dead games usually can't afford. They didn't just apologize, they acted fast and they acted visibly. I think we all are too familiar with how live service studios handle their disasters. It's either complete silence or a careful corporate statement, some quiet patching, and then just wait and hope the outrage burns out. Kuro didn't play it that way. They started communicating early with developer notes and public responses. They showed direct acknowledgement of the optimization and localization issues, and the general state of the launch. And when the Japanese weapon description backlash hit, they addressed that too. Not perfectly, but publicly. And then came the part that really changed the mood. What happens inside the game? Compensation, premium currency, and then the big one, a free 5-star standard selector on top of the one you already got from the launch. And if you don't play gacha games, that might not sound huge, but it was. Getting a free 5-star character, it's somewhat of a joke in the gacha community when a developer screws something up, because it never really happens. But here it just did. Giving away a free character is something that these games avoid, since that's their biggest part of the revenue. So this was the kind of move that told players Kuro was willing to give something up just to stop the bleeding. And they didn't stop there, because in later patches when things calmed down, they gave players that played that patch Zhang Liao not just a standard character, but a limited 5-star. By that point, the message was clear. Kuro was not trying to hide behind PR language and wait for the storm to pass. Now, this kind of generosity doesn't magically fix the bad performance overnight, but it does change the emotional temperature fast. Suddenly the studio didn't look silent, it looked like a team that knew how badly they had screwed it up, but they still had faith in their abilities and was trying to earn back the trust before it was too late. And more than anything, that bought them the one thing they needed the most: time. And what Kuro did with that time is what changed the whole narrative and would ultimately lead up to a bigger problem, the reality. But before the reality hit, they had to recover, and it didn't happen in one heroic patch, it happened in stages. Version 1.1 through 1.4 were not a huge victory lap, they were rebuild phase, fixing technical debt, cleaning up localization, stabilizing the experience, slowly proving to the people who stayed that the issues wasn't being ignored and wasn't just going to be papered over with rewards. This part matters because the launches like this usually don't fail in the spotlight. They fail in the slow and dragged out way, the kind where player numbers just keep falling until the players left don't even expect a fix anymore. But little by little, Wuthering Waves gave them a better answer. And this is when 2.0 arrived, and it took the people by storm. And the dead game narrative was long gone. The characters, the trailers, the story, it was epic. And not just that, but even in the game. The new expansion was a massive success. This was the point where it stopped looking like a studio who barely survived its own collapse and started looking like a studio that actually had recovered. Bigger confidence, better structure, and a clear goal: deliver an unforgettable experience. Even the image of Kuro itself started changing. It was now a studio that for the first time in a while looked like it had real momentum. However, that's exactly where the next problem begins. Because once the comeback becomes real, the underdog story gets a lot harder to hide behind. You know, there's this kind of weird protection that comes with being the underdog. When someone's struggling, it's easy to root for them. All the goodwill they do, it feels personal. Every mistakes they make, it feels temporary. Even the apologies they make, they feel somehow easier to accept. Kuro, they earned a lot of that goodwill. They were the studio that listened, the studio that gave players something back even when the ship looked like it was sinking. But here's the uncomfortable part. Once you're no longer an underdog, you now have a massive target on your back. Because no matter how good the game feels, or how strong your comeback is, having placed the throne amongst the giants, Kuro is still operating inside the same free live service machine everyone else is. The same system that always pushes toward massive profit. It doesn't erase what they did right, but it does make the next question harder. Was that early generosity just out of good conscience? Maybe. Or maybe it was the exact strategic move a dying game had to do in order to survive. And now that Kuro isn't fighting for survival anymore, they have to answer a much uglier question. Can a studio that looked like the hero still stay the hero once it doesn't need to anymore? That's the question that can kill any comeback. But the reason we're even asking it, and the reason why Wuthering Waves is here to be judged, is because players can tell the difference between a broken game and a hollow one. Broken can be fixed, hollow can't. You can patch bugs, optimize performance, but you can't patch in the kind of depth that the game needs in order to make people stay when the rest of the game is barely holding together. That's the real reason Kuro survived, not because they were generous or they reacted fast, but because there was actually something underneath worth saving. It feels too simple to reduce Kuro to just another monetization machine. Studios that only care about the revenue usually don't spend this much effort on details most players will never notice. Tiny animation touches and a little bit of polish. Even something as small as the subtle sparks underneath the bike when you lean into a drift. Somebody cared enough to put it there, even knowing most audience would never think about it. It doesn't erase the business model, but it does tell you that there's a real creative culture behind the game. This is not a clean victory. The first year left scars, and some of them are still clearly visible as of Lahai Roy. But Kuro earned back the trust the hard way, taking the hit publicly and proving the game was actually worth saving. And here comes the hard part. Kuro isn't an underdog anymore. They're not fighting to survive. Now they're fighting to live up to what they became. They already proved that they can survive the collapse. Now they have to prove they can carry the weight that comes with it. Thanks for watching all the way through. If you enjoyed this kind of deep dive, subscribe for more and I'll see you in the next video.